time. Okay. Sort you. Background. All right, let's get going here. First tray table of the day. It will not be the last. All right. So welcome back. Oh man, start of week 2 out of 13. Or 14. So week 1 down, 13 weeks to go. All right. So let's get into it here. So obviously, we're in a new unit now. We're done with historical perspectives on work. We're going to start into some concepts and theories here. Is the exam going to be straight from the slides? Okay, so not exactly. So slides and lectures, right? So I wouldn't advise going into the exam without having at least listened to or paid attention to and taken some notes on the lectures, right? So it's not going to just be the slide content because I say a lot of stuff that isn't on the slides, right? The slides are sort of my kind of skeleton, and I build out from there and hopefully tell you some other stuff that is interesting, right? And that will be testable. So yes and no, right? I won't test on anything that isn't in the in the lectures. But now I'm getting distracted by the comments. I won't test on anything that isn't in the lectures, right? So if there's something in the textbook that isn't in the lectures, you don't need to worry about that. But definitely, more than just what is in the bullet points on the slide. I hope that helps. Good morning. Happy Monday, if there is such a thing. My daughter had a really hard time getting up today. I don't know why. All right, is it important to remember names? So in the sense that, yes, you should know the names of people and associate the concepts with them, certainly. In the sense of like, will I ask you a multiple choice question that's like, who said this? Was it Marx? Was it Durkheim? Was it, von Mises? Or something like that. No, I won't ask those kinds of questions because I don't like those kinds of questions. I don't think they show us anything. But definitely you should, have a sense of who, what thinkers are associated with what ideas. Are you going to have practice questions? Yes. As we get closer to the exam, I will give you practice questions, both for the multiple choice and for the short answer. Okay. All right. How should you study for the midterm? The best possible way you know how. It's a tough question because everybody studies a little bit differently. Maybe we'll leave that for another class as we get a little bit closer to the midterm. But generally, review slides your notes on the slides, do the practice questions that I give you, and you should be all good. That would be my advice. But then I never studied for exams, and I was fine. So, I'm a bad exemplar. Okay, so when it comes to work, we are gonna, I'll go back one slide. All right, I think we're done with questions for the moment. Okay, so we're done obviously with our kind of sketch of kind of history. And as we go through, we're gonna touch on some more history of specific periods. But now we're gonna turn to some of the basic, like some of the core thinkers and some really important concepts when it comes to thinking about work. So some of these you'll probably have heard of, and again, some of this might be stuff that you talked about a little bit in high school, right? When you're talking about economic systems, and some of it won't be. Okay, so our first guy, obviously, I think you're probably familiar with. This is Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith, who wrote the very important tome on economics called The Wealth of Nations. And Smith is the father of what we would typically refer to as classical economics, or also liberal economics, right? So he is the father of classical or liberal economics, right? And he's coming right around the same time as we are getting into the Industrial Revolution. So as all of these changes are happening in European society, and specifically in England and Scotland, he is kind of trying to tease out what is going on, what any of all of this means, right? And so he is the first one to talk about this system that we today call capitalism, right? So capitalism, this mode of production where essentially the goal of people in the system is to invest capital, to use their capital to generate profits, right? To basically drum up more economic activity. Now, a couple of really important things that Smith talks about. So one, he thinks that wealth and, that capitalism is going to lead to more wealth and more societal prosperity. Specifically because what Smith sees is that capitalism, as compared to, say, feudalism, increases production, right? You get a lot more stuff. And the more stuff there is, the more it can be distributed to everybody, right? When you have situations of scarcity tends to lead to only the wealthiest people in a society having access to goods. When you have, a lot of production and excess production, you're going to get a trickle down, and those extra goods and all of that extra value is going to trickle down along social classes. Okay. Key to capitalism for Smith is competition, right? Basically, the idea that capitalism leads to always, companies and people always attempting to gain profit by, doing a couple of things, finding, gaps in the market or a niche in the market, right? Producing something that no one else is producing, or producing that same thing that someone else is producing, but doing it better and cheaper, therefore lowering costs, lowering prices, and increasing profit. And that all of this is going to lead to growth, right? That economics, rather than, in a sense, and when you think of, say, maybe like Marxist thinkers, Smith thought that, economies weren't what you might call a pie, right? And it's not like you have to subdivide the pie amongst all the populations. Basically, Smith's idea is that capitalism does a great job of growing the pie, right? Of making the pie bigger and bigger and bigger so that everybody can get a slice of the pie rather than just a few. Whereas like Marxists will think that that pie is a fixed size and, you split it up amongst amongst the population. Smith thought that you can generate more and more out of capitalism. Now, the key to capitalism, according to Smith, is the division of labor. And he thinks this is what capitalism does much better than prior systems, is it splits tasks under capitalism into smaller and smaller specialized tasks, right? So last class, I was describing Without too much detail, because again, I don't know that much about shoemaking, the process of making shoes in the medieval period, right? And it would have been a cobbler. The cobbler would have, done everything from cutting the leather to finally putting the soles on the boot, right? All the way through the process. It's one skilled person kind of doing everything. Under capitalism, those tasks get split, right, into smaller and smaller kind of segments. So, I mean, this happens in the factory system, right? You get specialists who do different tasks along the assembly line, right? And they will tend to repeat that task over and over again. So people get super specialized in one task. Maybe it's putting the laces on the shoe or putting the rivets on the shoe or putting the soles on the shoe, but they get super specialized at that task and they do that one thing over and over again, right? And those tasks also tend to become kind of what we call de-skilled, right? Because many of them, take us from this world where you had to know how to make the entire shoe okay, now all you really need to know is how to clip that rivet or those rivets on the shoe that your laces go through or whatever it happens to be. But that division of labor means every single person can do that one task without changing, right? So if I'm the guy who puts the rivets on the shoe, I have my one tool, my little rivet putter. Clearly, again, I don't know that much about shoes. I should stop using this example. But you would just do that over again, right? So you never have to move and you never have to switch tools, right? So you don't lose all of this time, switching tasks, finding the right tool. Maybe that tool got lost. This kind of approach, by the way, this division of labor, will get picked up later, and we'll talk about it, later in the course, because it kind of comes back later on with companies like Boeing, where basically, Boeing at a certain point sets up all of its factories along these same sorts of lines so that they can produce aircraft as quickly as possible with the least amount of task switching and tool switching possible to really kind of simplify along the line of production how quickly things go, right? So it could be for something like it's not a principle that only applies, say, to early capitalism. It's very much something that companies still think about when they're thinking about production today. Okay, now this last one, you probably heard this term, right? The invisible hand of the market. And this has a lot of implications, right? One of them is that for Smith, markets are fundamentally self-regulating. Regulating. They're self-regulating in the sense that they require very little oversight from governments or from anyone else to work. Why? Because the best practices are going to win the day, right? The person who's the most innovative, who's doing things for the cheapest, who's offering, say, the most benefits to workers is going to come out on top in Smith's kind of model. So capitalism should kind of work on its own. And it's driven, what drives, say, social benefits from capitalism is individuals pursuing their own self-interest, right? It's the pursuit of profit, the pursuit of market share, the creation of new products to meet in, new market demand that actually creates all of the value. Now, that said, sometimes Smith is a little bit caricatured, right? In terms of, because, when we get later on and we get to people like Milton Friedman, who's in the kind of 1960s, 70s, and 80s, who's what we would call a neoclassical economist at University of Chicago. They take a lot of these same ideas and basically kind of repackage them for the 1970s and 80s. They focus on the kind of self-interest, and Friedman is well known for saying that the basic principle of capitalism is that greed is good, right? But Smith was a pretty deep thinker in a lot of ways, and one of the things that Smith was very aware of was the conditions in the factories of the time, right? And he was aware that capitalism, in its pursuit of profit, ultimately very much could lead to the exploitation of workers. That it wasn't all fun and games, it wasn't all sunny ways, that there were serious problems. Now, Smith thinks that eventually this problem would sort itself out without a ton of regulation, because what would happen is workers would get more skilled, right? There would be improvements in the productivity of workers, right? They would get more skilled, the machines would get better, and therefore they would start to be able to demand higher wages from their employers. So it didn't need a ton of intervention, but it's something that he suggested employers should get ahead of, always understanding that happier workers were going to be more productive, and that, abuses might lead to short-term profit, but were unlikely, he thought, to lead to long-term profits. Okay, so Smith. Amongst other things, Smith and a lot of economists, right up until well into the end of the 19th and really in the beginning and middle of the 20th century, basically subscribed to what's called a labor theory of value. And I'll talk lots about labor theory of value, but it's worth kind of talking about a bit. So when thinking of, the overall value of a product, right, of something that is produced under capitalism, Smith basically thought that all of the value, right, so all of that extra money that the factory owner or business owner could charge for that good ultimately came out of the labor of the worker, right? So where does value come from? It comes from labor, right? So why is a shirt worth $15? Well, it's worth that because basically the basic equation is the value of the kind of supply, I'll say supplies, but we say the commodities that went into it, plus labor equals the value, right? So supplies plus labor equals the value. So when you're thinking of, say, a t-shirt, it's the cotton plus the work that went in to growing that cotton and turning that cotton into a t-shirt that tells you how much that particular thing is worth. Okay, so yeah, like the value for consumers, you can calculate the labor differential. Another kind of way that Smith thinks of it is the labor differential that one gets from having an item or commodity. So another way of thinking of value in a classical system is how much time, energy do you save by buying that thing, right? So if you are going to, I don't know, even something as simple as a candle, how long would it take you to make a candle plus the supplies, right? That's inherently kind of the value of it. So it's the labor that goes into it. How much labor are you saving potentially, ultimately by buying that product instead of making it yourself? Okay, again for Smith, the division of labor, is the natural evolution of human societies. So he thinks that, increasingly as economies get more complex, that division of labor under capitalism is going to get greater and greater, and people are just going to get more and more specialized because that's what modern economies need. It's more efficient if people are good at a few simple tasks than having generalists, right? Someone who's good at the whole process. It's actually more efficient if you're just good at that one simple task. Okay, now so he thinks this is 100% true in industry, a little bit less true in agriculture, where Smith doesn't really see a division of labor being possible, because farm equipment wasn't where it would be today, right? You still needed, he thought, farmers to be sort of generalists. Okay, so you've probably also heard of this, right? Again, this is our sort of basic economics, this idea of supply and demand. And again, this is the sort of liberal / classical notion of how markets work. So, and I mean, it's pretty accurate in at least some ways, though when you get to, say, Austrian economics, Austrian economics, I'll talk about this in a slight, nuance this a little bit with things like what they call marginal value. But I'll get to the Austrians in a sec, because we'll talk about it. They have a very different notion of value. Okay, anyway, we'll worry about that in a sec. So, we all know supply and demand, right? This is how economies work. Basically, the cost of a commodity, right, or a product, basically, as supply increases, prices should ultimately drop, right? So if you have something with a lot of supply, the price should be relatively low. However, if you have something where demand outstrips supply, right? So if supply outstrips demand, you're going to get a drop in prices. If demand outstrips supply, then you're going to get a rise in prices. And you can think of this, right, like during COVID. I know no one wants to remember COVID, but during COVID, everybody was home, so all sorts of people started to undertake home renovation projects, right? And the price of lumber skyrocketed, right? It went from, and I know this because I built a fence the year before, and my sister built a fence during COVID. And when I was buying fence boards, I paid, basically $1.39 per linear foot. When my sister did it, just about a year and a half later, she paid $7.87 per linear foot, which made her fence a whole lot more expensive than mine, right? And this was just driven by the fact that all of a sudden, people were home and they were like, okay, I'm going to finally take up woodworking, which I've always dreamed of. So I can only imagine there's a lot of Ryobi tools kicking around somewhere that are now gathering dust. But this was, a really constrained supply, because lumber, in terms of the market, is planned out over a long period of time, because you can only cut down so many trees, right? I think Alberta has like a 200-year lumber supply kind of plan. So you can only cut down so many trees, so you can't fundamentally increase supply that quickly. So when demand goes up, price goes up, right? And this is what we think of as, how capitalism works in general, right? Constrained supply leads to high prices. A lot of supply leads to lower prices, right? So this is mostly true of commodities. It gets a little bit more complicated when you talk about products, right? Because when you talk about, say, a product, let's say like an iPhone, things get a little bit more complex, right? Because, in theory, there's as many iPhones out in the marketplace as you probably could want, right? Like if you wanted to go buy 100 iPhones today, I'm sure you could easily go down to the Apple store and they'd roll you out a cart of 100 iPhones and they'd be very happy to take your money. And there's probably some upward bound to the number of iPhones, but it's, well outstripping, immediate demand for it. And yet the price of iPhones remains high, right? What's the new iPhone Pro 16 Pro Max worth? Like $1,800 or something, right? It's just like, $1,800. Despite the fact that, right, if you want just a smartphone, you can go down to 7-Eleven and there's a rack of them. I mean, they're terrible Android phones, but they're there, right? You're not lacking supply. So when it comes to products, something else is going on. We'll talk about that again when we talk about the marginal revolution of the Austrians, because it matters quite a bit. So again, it's not exactly right, because as we've gotten, iPhones were relatively uncommon when they first came out, which potentially justified their price, but now those same technologies exist in huge supply. So something else is clearly going on. Okay. But supply and demand, or at least this notion, remains pretty key to the idea of market capitalism, right? That everything functions on supply and demand, though again, I think we can nuance this a bit when it comes to products, because I think there's clearly another principle going on. But we still kind of think that it's true, right? And this was strongly embraced, this idea of supply and demand by the neoliberal right in the 1970s and 80s, and then through the 90s. And again, from what's called, so these were guys who took the liberal ideas and then brought them back into the mainstream after decades of Marxist and Keynesian economics through the back half of the 20th century. Okay, and yeah, key ideas for Smith: markets are rational and self-regulating, and they don't need excessive intervention from governments. Okay, so I kind of step on that sort of neoliberal process, but one that has a very distinct form is something that's often referred to as Fordism, right? And Fordism, basically, obviously, we get the word from Henry Ford, right? The founder of the Ford Motor Company. And his particular sort of innovation, right, which was essentially to take one kind of aspect of Smith's theory and Smith's ideas, this idea of the division of labor, and to really sort of take it up to the next level, right? So you think of, I think we all know Henry Ford, right, and his important innovation, which was the assembly line, right? So Ford takes this kind of idea of the division of labor and basically says, okay, instead of you going around the factory and doing your one task, or say like product, whatever product you're working on, moving, you start your shoes here and then someone carries them over to the next station. Basically, he organized his factories in the way that we think of factories today, right? Around simple, low-skill, repeatable tasks that moved on an assembly line, right? So last class, we watched that video with Charlie Chaplin, right? That old silent movie that's supposed to be kind of funny. And that's the assembly line, right? Where one person, tightens the bolts and then the thing moves on, tightens the bolts. And this is still how a lot of industrial manufacturing is essentially done, right? Everybody along different stations has single tasks that they do along an assembly line, and the product kind of moves. They do minimal movement, they do minimal tool switching, and it makes the process very, very efficient. So much so, right, that by a couple decades after Henry Ford had started, the assembly lines, in Dearborn, Michigan, and around Detroit, everybody had sort of copied this model, understanding immediately that it was super efficient and increased productivity, increased, efficiency and profits to a huge degree. Because suddenly, right, you could have these very de-skilled workers doing very repetitive tasks over and over again in very efficient ways. It was great for profits, right? It was really bad for people. And we'll talk about alienation as we go through the course. Okay, so I have a question slide in a sec. I'll go back here for a sec. All right. Okay, is Adam Smith's conclusion of capitalism a fact or his belief? Does capitalism actually spur innovation, or is this belief? I mean, I think it's pretty clear that when we talk about capitalism and innovation, that the most innovative economies historically have all tended to be capitalist, right? They are, and it's not to say that innovations didn't happen in, say, the Soviet Union, right? Certainly innovations happen, but the pace and impact of innovations driven, in essence, I think, by the self-interest of those creating them, and the fact that they knew that their innovations could lead, to fabulous wealth, definitely does create a lot of innovation, a lot of new product categories, and a sort of different incentive structure, which is, always trying to find that product that isn't being, that doesn't exist, a market that isn't being served, and something that you can sell. Now, of course, with capitalism, one of the problems is that capitalism produces a lot of junk, right? Capitalism produces a lot of stuff that is really, really useful, like iPhones and cars, and a lot of stuff that, how shall we put it, ends up in like the liquidation supercenter because it was on the shelves at Walmart for 12 months and no one bought it because, you don't really need that thing for, that press that you use for making French fries. Because really, how often do you make French fries at home? And so it might have been the most super innovative French fry maker in the whole darn world. But actually, it's just kind of junk, right? So capitalism does a great job of innovation, also creates a lot of crap. And you never quite know, I think, whether you're creating, innovation or crap in capitalism until you take it to the market and see what the market has to say about it. And yeah, there's a lot of products. Right? Just go through a Walmart and just kind of look around, and you'll find a lot of junk that will end up on the in the garbage dump at some point. Okay, but yeah, I think capitalism definitely spurs innovation. So, will the term liberalism always refer to classical liberalism in this class as opposed to modern political definition that has different tenets? Yeah, so when we're talking about economics, we're going to use the term liberalism as this kind of, Adam Smith vision of liberalism, right? Of liberal economics, rather than, some idea of liberal politics, right? Leftist or left-wing kind of politics, right? We're not going to use it that way, but liberal in the sense of like free market, little government interference, and an idea of a self-regulating market is the way that we're going to use liberalism in this class. That's a really good question. Wow, already a half hour gone. And I haven't even made it to Uncle Carl yet. Okay, so Karl Marx, or Marxist economics. The reason I call him Uncle Carl is because, when you're a sociologist, you end up spending so much time with Karl Marx that he feels like a member of your family. I teach this class, I teach Intro to Soc, and you talk a lot about Karl Marx and Intro to Sociology as well. So I really feel like Karl Marx is, kind of that crazy uncle with the weird beard that I never wanted. So I call him Uncle Carl. So Marx. So obviously Marx is another really, really famous economist, coming slightly later than Adam Smith. And in a lot of ways, Marx is reacting to a lot of the problems that get generated out of capitalism, right? So by the time Marx is, he's born in 1818, but by the time he's most active, kind of from about the mid-1840s, and then the 1880s, through that period, and the 1860s are a particularly productive time for Marx, capitalism is well on its way, and it's produced, how shall we say, a lot of social problems and a lot of misery, right? There's big industrial cities, right? They started in, Birmingham, Manchester, London, in, Glasgow and Edinburgh, in, England and Scotland. But then, they've spread to the continent. You have Paris, Berlin, Frankfurt, all sorts of cities across France and Germany that are also industrializing at a really fast pace. You've got a lot of slums, you've got a lot of really poor people, and Marx has a problem with all of this. So, we tend to think of this as, Marxism, because I think Marxism has a kind of a bad name. Kind of in the 1990s, sociology renames sort of Marxist perspectives to conflict theory or conflict perspectives, right? Or theories of sociology that really focus on social conflict. Typically in Marxist thought, it's between classes, right? So the conflict is between social classes. And again, you're probably familiar with some of this. Okay, so what is kind of in Marxist thought? Well, Marx basically has a couple of pretty simple kind of terms and ideas, right? So he thinks that basically one of the key parts of any society, right? So this he takes this back, if you read the Communist Manifesto or if you read Capital, neither of which I actually recommend reading because they're pretty tough reads. But if you read Marx, one of the things that he suggests is that basically every society has been categorized by its its mode of production, how it makes things, right? How it makes the goods that the society needs. And the mode of production, he thinks, is made up of two things, which is the means of production, so how things are actually made, right? So factories in the industrial period, prior to that, in the feudal period, everything would have been made by skilled artisans. Whatever it happens to be, right? He traces this back to the Roman period, to antiquity, but that's not really important. The means of production is how you make stuff. The social relations of production is how society is organized in order to allow you to make those things through that means of production. So The means of production in industrial Europe obviously is capitalism and, industrial capitalism through factories in particular. The social relations of production, he thinks, is that society has become structured along three basic classes, right? So you have your bourgeoisie, right? The bourgeoisie, according to Marx, is the owners of the means of production, right? And he will, these are the sort of villains in Marxism, right? They are the ones who own the factories, who own the means of production, who profit outrageously from the labor of other people. They get all the profit. The people who actually make stuff get basically subsistence wages. And then you've got, the proletariat, which is roughly speaking the working class, right? The factory workers, those who actually have nothing to trade other than their labor, right? Other than their physical ability to work. And so they trade it for whatever wages they can get. And then you have this third class, the petit bourgeoisie, which Marx has a bit of derision for. So petty bourgeoisie, in kind of Marxist terms, I like to use it as an insult, right? When someone is like, say someone who's like middle class is acting like they're all hoity-toity and they're acting like they're Elon Musk, you could accuse them of being petty bourgeois. And the advantage is most of them will have no idea what it means, but they'll know that you're insulting them, which is always kind of a fun way to go. So if you ever have that one friend, right, who starts driving an Audi and then suddenly they're acting like they're a billionaire, you can accuse them of being petty bourgeois. It's fun, trust me. It's really fun when people who have no idea have to go look up your insults. I will say that. Okay, so what is the petty bourgeoisie? Basically, Marx thinks of them as kind of the lower middle class. They are people who are just as oppressed by the system of production under capitalism, right? They're barely holding on. They maybe own small businesses, but they're about to be crushed by the sort of, I'm going to do that all term, aren't I? It's the second time. I taught in this class all semester last year, and I never once hooked this microphone. All right, let's throw that in my pocket. Right, so they are just as much at risk as the proletariat of being made poor by the bourgeoisie who are going to come, build bigger factories, take their businesses. And yet for Marx, the petty bourgeoisie, they identify with the bourgeoisie. So a petty bourgeois is someone who doesn't see how the whole capitalist system ultimately is going to lead to their downfall because they're so focused on getting rich or, identifying with the values of a class that's essentially trying to destroy them that they can't see it, right? So there's a certain myopia in the petty bourgeoisie. Okay. Because again, Marx's idea is that what's going to survive is just really, really big factories, right? And everything else is going to get crushed underfoot. Okay, so what do we have under capitalism, right? Very much like Smith, a division of labor, which, and I think I have these terms on another slide. Yes, I'll talk about surplus value on another slide. But basically, it's all that extra value that gets created out of the factory system, right? So, the t-shirt that comes out of the factory is worth a lot more than the cotton that went into it. That's surplus value. Marx, of course, thinks that this leads to a lot of exploitation, particularly in the fact that workers never see the sort of equivalent benefit of their work. They get a little bit of the profit in terms of wages, but most of the profit goes to the owners. And one of the things that Marx is really focused on, and actually I think this is one of his more interesting critiques of capitalism, is that there's a loss of worker control. And here again, he's sort of thinking about the feudal period and those craftsmen that were making, the boots or the horseshoes or whatever. And he thought they controlled a lot of their own lives, right? They controlled when they went to work, how long they worked, how long they stopped for meals, right? How much they produced, and all of that stuff. And basically what Marx says is under this kind of, proletariat bourgeoisie split, you control none of that, right? You like Charlie Chaplin in that film, right? You punch in your time card when you show up at the factory. You take breaks when they tell you to, of whatever length they tell you to take it, right? You get your today, obviously it wouldn't have been the case at the time. You take your 2 15-minute coffee breaks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and you take your half-hour lunch break, and that's all you get, and that is set very much by your employer, and you produce how much they tell you to produce, right? You can't be like, man, I produced 3 pairs of shoes today. That's probably enough, right? I'm happy with whatever. That'll support my family for, a week. That's enough shoes for today. I'm going to go, lie down in a field and have nice dreams of sheep or something. I don't know. I don't know what people in the medieval period dreamed about. Whatever they dreamed about, right? That person making shoes or that blacksmith, there was a certain point where it's just been like, okay, that's it for the day. I'm tired. Everybody go home. I'll make horseshoes for you tomorrow. I've made enough money, right? So the loss of control and loss of autonomy is a big part of capitalism for Marx. Along with that too, he thinks that leads to alienation, right? Where suddenly you don't control your work, you don't control what you produce, you don't control how much you produce. In a lot of cases, especially in this period, Marx thought a lot of the people working in these factories couldn't even afford the things that they were making, right? So they were making products for people that were far richer than them and who could afford them, and they would never be able to live them. And he thought that left people with kind of feeling out of place, like they'd lost control of their lives and they were just cogs in a machine. Now, Marx's prediction of what's kind of going to happen. So, very famously, Marx thinks the history of all production, right, going back to antiquity, so the Roman, Greek and Roman period, is always it's always about class conflict. For Marx, there's always sort of an upper class that has power and a lower class that's oppressed, right? So there's the oppressors, I can write, and the oppressed. And this is the key, in a sense, to, Marxist kind of thinking and Marxist economics. So here you have the bourgeoisie, and here you have the proletariat, and to a lesser extent, the petty bourgeoisie, right? They are the oppressed under capitalism. Okay, so he thinks that ultimately this always leads to class conflict, with the classes fighting for kind of control of the society. And of course, his very famous prediction in the Communist Manifesto, we'll talk about it again in a bit, is that there would be this revolution, right, the communist revolution, where the workers would seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, kill them all, and take control, and then distribute things evenly amongst the population, finally getting rid of class conflict, because you would have communism, common ownership of everything, with that very famous Marxist slogan, right? To each, or from each according to ability, to each according to need, right? So that the economy would work by you giving what you're able to, and everybody receives what they need. Okay. 7 minutes. Okay, so in Marxist economics, right, what you have broadly in capitalism is the creation of surplus value, right? So surplus value is basically whatever, so after you sell a product, right? So you sell your iPhone, the surplus value is, whatever is the remaining capital. So whatever the remaining money is after you've paid for the cost of raw materials and the cost of labor, right? So surplus value is basically the profit. So whatever it costs, I don't know, if it costs $300 to produce an iPhone and get it to market, right? And you sell the thing for $1,700. Again, we're doing crude math here. $1,700, right? Your surplus value is about $1,400, right? That's a dollar sign, $1,400. That's surplus value, right? So Marx thinks like that's, basically the goal of capitalism is to maximize surplus value. And you do this, in a couple of basic ways. You do it by and the principal one is by keeping wages really low. Because, the cost of raw materials, Marx doesn't really think there's much to be done about it, right? The cost of raw materials is what it is. So the only thing you can really affect as a factory owner is the cost of labor. So your goal in the bourgeoisie is to keep wages as low as possible, so that by the time you subtract the cost of materials from the cost of labor, this number is as big as possible, right? If you suddenly start treating workers really well and you give them, fair wages, your profit is going to decline. Your surplus value is going to be lessened, right? I mean, you still hear at the end of the day this kind of notion of value and this kind of notion of economics from, say, like if you pay attention to politics, the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, right? And the way he talks about the grocery chains, right? The grocery stores, and we all love grocery stores, right? They're all the best. I'm kidding, they're horrible. But his way of talking about, say, Loblaws and the whole chain that controls Superstore is he's essentially talking, about how much surplus value a chain like Loblaws generates by underpaying workers and overcharging customers, right? So you'll put basically as much cost as you can, you charge as much as possible, and then pay as little as possible for raw material and labor. Okay, so according to Marx, what the goal of the bourgeoisie is to provide workers with only what he calls replacement value, right? So replacement value, the bare minimum you need so that you can go to work the next day, right? So to keep the cycle going. So you want to pay people just enough so that they can afford their rent or wherever they're going to live, their food, and whatever else. You don't want them to have much for leisure, right? You want to make sure that all they have is replacement value, so they have to keep coming back to work the next day, right? They essentially have no choice. You can never give them so much money that they're, independently wealthy, and then they could just stop coming to work, because you need them to keep coming to work to provide that labor so that you get that value. Okay, so, and yeah, again, Marx is coming out of a very particular moment in history where, all of this industrial development had led to very poor living conditions in a lot of Europe for the working class. Okay, so, do I have 3 minutes? How am I doing for time? I got videos. I can show you those next time. There's a lot on this slide. Why don't I stop here? We'll stop with profit is theft, right? A kind of key Marxist idea. We'll talk about it in terms of the labor theory of value. On Wednesday, we'll keep going with Marx, and then we're going to kind of move into some Austrian economics, which to me is the fun stuff, because it kind of scrambles this whole equation in major ways. I'll see you then. Hi.
Sorry, I just joined this class.
Of course. Yeah, that happens.
I noticed there were some slider questions. Was any of the marks?
No, that's just like so people can ask. It's a big class, right? So
There's no polls or...
no. Yeah, it's just if you have a question, type it in. I'll answer them in class. Even if you're live streaming the class, you can still, be watching and asking questions if you're at home or over in that part of the campus where I'm sure you are most of the time. So yeah, no, it's just the 3 exams for grades.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Oh, thinking that 13 more weeks of this semester feels like a long time, but I'm sure it'll go by quickly.
Oh yeah.